But again, the number of these have doubled, if not tripled, since I'm aware of them. They first started when I was in the first Bush administration. They were beginning to grow. They've changed in character. They're being used, as some of you know, for family court, child custody cases. They're helping people with dual diagnosis, mental health, as well as drugs. I do take your point and agree with it. Many individuals on the bench have not had special training for this, and so that's why not all of them want to do it or have found it useful. We've tried, and I think there have been organizations partly funded by the government at the national level to try to help provide that training. But it's an enormously beneficial way to deal with this peculiar disease and to get people to stop the cycle of self-destruction where it works. It doesn't work for everybody.
Maybe we found a place for judicial empathy after all. Yes, sir.
I recently read the book Patriarch by Professor Richard Norton Smith as a means to get to know what he thought, to take a 10-day tour with him called Presidents and Patriots. In that book, he points out that George Washington at Mount Vernon was known as the best grower of poppies and the best producer of opium along the Virginia coast. He also used laudanum, which is a offshoot of morphine with a little bit of wine and water. He used it on his gums, very much like what Mr. Baker talked about. Would you consider George Washington a proper moral authority, and should that be in the history books?
I think that's directed at me.
It certainly wasn't directed at me.
Yeah. Well, look, frankly, I think it's kind of a silly distinction. We distinguish between medicine. There are many medicines that have dangerous side effects. Some of them are opioids or similar products that do cause dependency, and we try to handle those with caution. There are some problems with that, and for those who want to talk about decriminalization, I'd ask them to look at the problem we have with prescription medications that are controlled quite dramatically, and yet we have some problems with that today that we're trying to deal with. But the fact is, there's a difference between medications, even changes in understandings of the uses of medications that have happened over the time of patent medicines and laudanum and other substances that were part of a huge abuse problem that did cause a reaction. There's a difference between that and obvious abuse and use of these substances for the purposes of becoming intoxicated for recreational purposes. Again, if it was harmless, we wouldn't be having this discussion. And I suspect we're not going to have it. If you actually remember this 5 or 10 years from now, this session, I believe you will wonder why on earth we discussed this, because the change in understanding this as a disease is going to be so profound. It's going to be like, why were we debating whether or not to have a disease? Why are we debating whether or not to distribute products, the sole purpose of which is to make people sick or to keep them sick? We need to obviously prevent them from starting on the path of getting sick, which is what I think every administration I'm aware of since I was born has been trying to do. And we need to try to cut off the sale of this, and I think we've gotten better at it. I think the change in availability, the change in our technology and our ability to screen and intervene with people in the criminal justice system, in the health system, in the education system, in the workplace, are all tools that help us use our understanding more effectively. And for those who, and that's why I'm a little annoyed, and I did pick a fight with my one colleague on the panel, that we are spending precious, even nonprofit dollars, which they're free to do, but let's have a debate.
Well, let's have a debate. Let's have some more questions.
I live in a small rural county in Washington State where our main drug-related problem is abuse of prescription drugs. Now, our sheriff earlier this year came up with a program where people could bring drugs like oxycodone into local pharmacies where they would be safely disposed of, so they didn't get in the municipal water stream or into the garbage where they could be resold or reused for illegal purposes. And he made each pharmacist a special deputy so they could legally take these in and dispose of them. Everybody thought this was a very good idea until he got a letter from the DEA saying, you can't do that. In fact, we're going to come after these pharmacists as drug dealers if you do that. Needless to say, that put a very quick end to this program. I'd like to get your comments both from the point of view of federalism, the limits of state and federal law enforcement authority, and also just good public policy. What should the role of the federal government be in drug enforcement versus that of the states?
That sounds like it's a direction to you, Mr. Baker.
Well, I think I've laid out a good bit of it, but I try to target it a little bit towards prescription drugs. First of all, in the United States, I think there is a, quote, drug culture that derives from our emphasis on prescription drugs in a way that I don't see anywhere else in the world, basically. I mean,
The AMA is our
constant-
biggest junkie.
What's that?
The AMA, American Medical.
Well, how about the pharmaceutical? Okay, I mean, this is constantly advertised, and everybody thinks, you know, pop a pill, and that's the solution to it. So we are open or habituated to this kind of mentality. I think that's part of the problem. The other part of the problem is, you know, the FDA wants to do more and more, and they want to classify vitamins as drugs, and they want to control this, and they want to control that. It's the nature of bureaucracy. It simply wants more power. And when a federal bureaucrat gets more power, it's taking power away from a state bureaucrat.
Can I just, I think that's a mistake by DEA to get to the specific of the point. We dealt with this a little bit when I was in office. You're going to deal with it in the current administration about allowing the pharmaceuticals that are left over to come back. The effort we made was to advise people to dispose of them. There's not to get into the details here, but there's two levels of the problem. Youth abuse, which is basically smurfing pills out of the medicine cabinet. So keep them under your control, throw them away when you're done with them. There's a lot of them out there now, and they help. They're a godsend to people. I mean, I take the point about pop a pill, but let's remember, we have generations whose lives are extended significantly because of modern medicine. And so I'm not an opponent of modern medicine, but we need to use its positives and control its negatives. But I do think there's a need for DEA, frankly, and I'm a supporter of DEA from long history, but DEA needs to find a way to allow people to bring back. The problem is accounting for them, because when they're from the point of being made, these substances are controlled and they're accounted for. When somebody spontaneously brings in an unknown quantity and deposits them in the system, that's a new entry point. I do think we should have ways of trusting people, as we do with evidence and other things, to take them as pharmacists or as other appropriate people who we have done some background check on or we've approved them in some way, take them and destroy them, because I do think in some cases where there's intense problems, simply tossing them in the trash is probably not entirely adequate.
Did you?
Well, I was going to ask you a question about the DEA and other agencies going after doctors who deal with pain and scrutinizing them so very closely to the point that they've scared them quite a bit. Are you in favor of that?
Well, am I in favor of flying pigs? I mean, basically, it doesn't really happen that way, although I know people say it and some people believe it. I spent a lot of time, because I heard this when I started in the office, going back and looking at specific cases of enforcement against doctors by DEA. Now, there are some areas, some principles that you could apply here where reasonable people could differ. But basically, the cases brought against individuals were not close calls. They were pill mills where millions and millions of dosage units were distributed in vast excess of normal practice. You can't have the problem we have. Again, children is one thing, smurfing out of the medicine cabinet. You can't be an oxycodone addict and smurf that out of grandma's medicine cabinet. She doesn't have enough in there. So the way someone who becomes dependent supplies this is to find either, there was an online source that's actually through national legislation. I think we've closed some of that down. It's being implemented, I think, during the current administration. But the pill mills, that some were in the New Orleans area for a long time, and in other places, there is some localization, and there is a way in which regulation and surveillance can find these, but you need to close them down. It's not so hard to find them. You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes. Go to a treatment center where a lot of people are there for pain medication and ask them, where'd you get it? They all get them from the same place, and they all know where the unscrupulous doctors are. The problem is the people doing the treatment and cleaning up the victims' problems are not talking to the people who have the responsibility to shut them down.
Next question.